From a killer who buried 33 bodies under his own house while performing as a clown for kids, to a mathematician who mailed bombs to strangers for 18 years without ever being caught, to a man who convinced 900 people to drink poison in a jungle. These are the 111 deadliest criminals in American history who were so dangerous, so calculated, and so completely unstoppable that the entire American law enforcement could not bring them down. And the most disturbing name on this list is saved for the very last second of this video, so do not click away. 1. Ted Bundy was so good-looking that women slid their phone numbers under his jail cell door while he was literally on trial for murder. This man escaped from prison not once but twice, and the second time, he just casually walked out like he forgot his jacket. He volunteered at a suicide hotline while actively being a serial killer on the side like some kind of evil part-time job. Florida finally got tired of his nonsense and sent 50,000 volts through him in 1989. The whole state celebrated like it was the Super Bowl. 2. Timothy McVeigh drove a rented truck packed with homemade explosives to a federal building in Oklahoma City and parked it like he was running a quick errand. April 19, 1995 became the deadliest domestic terror attack in American history, killing 168 people. This guy planned a massive attack for months and then got caught 2 days later because a state trooper spotted a missing license plate on his car. Not a high-speed chase, not a dramatic standoff, a license plate. The most dangerous domestic terrorist in American history got busted like a college kid with a broken taillight. 3. The Zodiac Killer mailed the San Francisco Police Department actual letters taunting them about his own murders, and the cops still never caught him. He invented his own secret code cipher and sent it to newspapers daring people to crack it. One of those ciphers sat unsolved for 51 years. He claimed 37 victims, but only 5 were confirmed, and he just vanished one day like he got bored of being a monster. The FBI had files. Detectives had suspects. Hollywood made movies about him. And the Zodiac Killer is still out there somewhere, probably watching those movies and laughing. 4. Al Capone ran the entire city of Chicago like it was his personal business empire, complete with bootleg alcohol gambling and enough violence to make the whole country nervous. He threw lavish dinner parties, gave turkeys to poor neighborhoods on Thanksgiving, and acted like a beloved community leader while ordering hits on people before dessert. The FBI tried everything to stop him and ultimately brought down the most feared gangster in America, not for murder, not for bootlegging, but for failing to pay his taxes. Al Capone was defeated by an accountant, and that is genuinely the funniest thing in American crime history. 5. Jesse James robbed banks and trains across Missouri like it was a perfectly normal career choice, and half of America actually cheered him on like he was a superhero. Newspapers called him a Robin Hood figure, even though there is zero evidence he gave anything to anybody poor. He was charming and bold and completely unhinged and somehow kept escaping every lawman in the country for years. Then one morning, a member of his own gang shot him in the back of the head for a reward, while Jesse was straightening a picture on his wall. Most embarrassing exit in outlaw history. 6. Bernie Madoff looked every single one of his clients in the eye and promised them guaranteed returns on their investments while running the largest Ponzi scheme in the history of human civilization. He stole $65 billion, not million, billion. He fooled celebrities, retirees, charities, and even other Wall Street professionals for decades while the SEC investigated him multiple times and somehow kept giving him a thumbs up. When the whole thing collapsed in 2008, his own sons turned him in. He went to prison at age 70 with a 150-year sentence and died there in 2021, still somehow acting surprised. 7. Lee Harvey Oswald shot President John F. Kennedy from a 6th-floor window of a Texas school book depository in Dallas on November 22, 1963, and then casually went to watch a movie. He was arrested at a local cinema a few hours later after also shooting a police officer on the way there, like he was having a very productive afternoon. Then 2 days later, while being transferred by police, a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby walked up and shot Oswald dead on live television in front of the entire country. America watched the assassin get assassinated and nothing about that day made any sense at all. 8. Jeffrey Dahmer invited 17 men to his apartment in Milwaukee, and none of them ever left, and somehow his neighbors just thought he was a weird, quiet guy who cooked a lot of meat. He drilled holes into people's heads trying to create zombies. That sentence is real, and it happened in Wisconsin. A prisoner escaped his apartment, went to police bleeding, and told them everything, and the cops actually returned the victim back to Dahmer because they thought it was a lover's quarrel. Dahmer was finally caught in 1991 when another intended victim escaped handcuffed and flagged down a patrol car, and the whole world lost its mind. 9. Ted Kaczynski lived alone in a tiny 10 by 12-foot cabin in the Montana wilderness, with no electricity, no running water, and apparently nothing but time to be absolutely furious at modern technology. For 17 years, he mailed homemade bombs to universities and airlines, killing 3 people and injuring 23 more, and the FBI had zero idea who he was. They called him the Unabomber and ran the longest and most expensive investigation in FBI history. His own brother finally recognized his writing style in a published manifesto and turned him in. A Harvard-educated math genius taken down because his brother knew his handwriting. 10. D.B. Cooper hijacked a Northwest Orient flight in 1971, told the flight attendant he had a bomb in his briefcase, ordered $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes, and then jumped out of the back of the plane somewhere over the Pacific Northwest and was never seen again. Ever. The FBI searched for decades. They found a small bundle of the ransom money in 1980 along a riverbank. And that was it. No body, no parachute, no trail. He is the only unsolved hijacking case in American aviation history, and somewhere out there is either a very rich old man or a very unfortunate pile of bones. 11. John Dillinger robbed so many banks across the Midwest in the 1930s that the FBI literally invented itself into a serious organization just to deal with him. He escaped from jail twice, and the first time he used a fake gun, he carved out of wood and painted with shoe polish to bluff his way past an entire jail full of guards. He became so famous that people lined up to shake his hand at gas stations. J. Edgar Hoover called him public enemy number 1 and made it personal. Dillinger was finally shot outside a Chicago movie theater in 1934 by agents who got a tip from a lady in a red dress. 12. Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch gang robbed so many trains and banks across the American West that the railroad companies literally hired a private posse to chase them full-time, like a subscription service for catching outlaws. Butch was so likable that even people he robbed kind of respected him afterward. He and the Sundance Kid eventually fled to Bolivia thinking they could outrun their reputation, and they could not. They reportedly died in a shootout with the Bolivian army in 1908, though some people swore they made it out alive. Either way, America turned their story into a Hollywood movie and made them legends forever. 13. Charles Manson never actually killed anybody himself and somehow ended up being the most terrifying cult leader in American history anyway. He convinced a group of young lost followers living on a California ranch that he was Jesus Christ and that a race war was coming, and that the Beatles were sending him secret messages through their lyrics. Then he sent his followers out to commit some of the most shocking murders in Hollywood history in 1969. Manson went to trial and spent the entire time grinning, carving an X into his forehead, and acting like the whole courtroom was his personal stage. He died in prison in 2017, still completely unrepentant. 14. James Earl Ray shot Martin Luther King Jr. on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968, and then tried to flee to another country like the whole world would not immediately know what happened. He escaped to Canada, then flew to England, then Portugal, running across multiple countries with a fake passport while the entire planet was searching for him. The FBI caught him at Heathrow Airport in London just 2 months after the assassination. He spent the rest of his life in prison, insisting he was part of a larger conspiracy, and America spent decades arguing about whether he was telling the truth. 15. John Wayne. Gacy threw neighborhood parties dressed up as Pogo. The clown entertained children, did construction work for the government, and buried 26 of his 33 victims underneath his own house in the crawlspace. His neighbors thought he was a great guy. Local politicians took photos with him. He won a Democratic Party volunteer award. Police actually visited his home during the investigation, smelled something awful coming from under the floor, and left without checking. When they finally searched the crawlspace in 1978, they found the unthinkable. Gacy looked at investigators and said that the only thing he was guilty of was running a cemetery without a license. 16. Eric Rudolph bombed the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, then bombed abortion clinics and a lesbian nightclub, and then simply walked into the woods of North Carolina and disappeared for 5 years while the FBI searched everywhere. He survived in the Appalachian wilderness, eating acorns and salamanders, and whatever he could forage while being on the FBI Most Wanted list. They found him in 2003 not through any sophisticated investigative breakthrough, but because a rookie police officer in Murphy, North Carolina, spotted him digging through a dumpster behind a grocery store at 4 in the morning. A man evaded the FBI for 5 years and got caught looking for leftovers in a trash can. 17. The Axeman of New Orleans sent a letter to local newspapers in 1919 announcing the exact date and time of his next attack, and then promised to spare any household that was playing jazz music when he arrived. New Orleans responded by throwing jazz parties across the entire city on that night, and every single bar and dance hall was packed. The Axeman kept his word and nobody died that night. He killed at least 6 people and attacked many more and was never identified. To this day, nobody knows who he was. New Orleans essentially partied its way to safety, and somehow that worked. 18. Whitey Bulger ran the Winter Hill Gang in South Boston for decades as the most feared Irish mob boss in American history, while simultaneously being a paid FBI informant, ratting out his rivals to the feds who were supposed to be arresting him. The FBI basically protected him from prosecution for years while he committed murders and ran drug operations and terrorized entire neighborhoods. He went on the run in 1994 and disappeared for 16 years, living quietly in Santa Monica, California, under a fake name with his girlfriend. He was caught in 2011 after a tipster saw his girlfriend's face on a TV advertisement and recognized her. 19. Billy the Kid killed his first man at age 15, was wanted for 21 murders by the time he was 21 years old, and somehow found time in between all of that to be described by people who met him as funny, charming, and genuinely fun to be around. He escaped from jail twice, including once where he killed 2 guards with his bare hands while still wearing handcuffs. Sheriff Pat Garrett tracked him down and shot him in a dark room in Fort Sumner, New Mexico in 1881. Billy the Kid was 21 years old. America immediately turned him into a romantic legend, which says a lot about America. 20. Jim Jones convinced over 900 Americans to follow him to a jungle compound in Guyana called Jonestown, where he controlled every aspect of their lives through fear, sleep deprivation, and public humiliation while calling himself a prophet. When a U.S. congressman flew down to investigate, Jones ordered his people to shoot the congressman dead on the airstrip. Then, on November 18, 1978, he instructed his followers to drink cyanide-laced punch, and over 900 people died, including 300 children, making it the largest mass death of American civilians until September 11th. Jim Jones died of a gunshot wound to the head, and nobody was entirely sure who pulled the trigger. 21. Sirhan shot Robert F. Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in 1968, right after Kennedy had just won the California presidential primary and was literally walking through the kitchen celebrating with his supporters. Sirhan was standing so close that witnesses tackled him immediately, and he was caught red-handed with the gun still in his hand. He went to trial, confessed, then unconfessed, then claimed he remembered nothing and has been requesting parole ever since. California denied his parole request 16 times. He was finally granted parole in 2021, and the entire Kennedy family showed up to fight against it and lost. 22. Richard Ramirez broke into homes across California in 1984 and 1985, leaving no consistent pattern, no specific victim type, and no obvious motive, which meant police had almost nothing to work with, while an entire state was sleeping with the lights on and every hardware store in California sold out of deadbolt locks. He left satanic symbols at crime scenes, wore AC/DC shirts, and told the courtroom he was beyond good and evil during his trial. He was eventually identified through a fingerprint, and when his name was released, angry neighbors in East Los Angeles caught him themselves before police even arrived. He died in prison in 2013, still receiving fan mail. 23. Andrew Kehoe was a 55-year-old school board treasurer in Bath Township, Michigan, who was angry about his property taxes and decided the most reasonable response was to wire the entire local elementary school with explosives. On May 18, 1927, he detonated the bombs, killing 36 children and 6 adults in what remains the deadliest school massacre in American history. Then, he drove his truck packed with more explosives to the scene and detonated it, killing the school superintendent and himself. Investigators later found he had wired his entire farm to blow up as well. He left a sign on his fence that read, "Criminals are made, not born," which was deeply unhelpful. 24. Lucky Luciano basically invented modern organized crime in America by throwing out all the old Sicilian mob rules, replacing them with a corporate structure complete with a ruling commission that settled disputes between families like a very violent board of directors. He ran prostitution, gambling, and bootlegging across New York City and was so untouchable that prosecutors could barely get close to him. Legendary prosecutor Thomas Dewey finally got him on prostitution charges in 1936 and sent him to prison for 30 to 50 years. Then, during World War II, the U.S. government secretly let him out of prison to help them secure the New York docks and plan the invasion of Sicily. America made a deal with the devil and then deported him to Italy afterward. 25. The Sundance Kid was Harry Longabaugh, who got his famous nickname from doing time in Sundance, Wyoming for horse theft, which is a very on-brand origin story for an outlaw. He and Butch Cassidy robbed trains and banks with the Wild Bunch Gang across Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana, with such style and efficiency that newspapers genuinely could not stop writing about them. The Pinkerton Detective Agency chased them relentlessly, so they fled to South America to start fresh, which did not work out the way they planned. The Bolivian army reportedly cornered them in 1908, and that was the end of the road for the most famous outlaw duo in American history. 26. David Koresh convinced dozens of families to move into a compound outside Waco, Texas, called Mount Carmel, where he declared himself a messianic figure, rewrote the rules of the Bible to suit himself, and stockpiled enough weapons to supply a small army. When federal agents showed up in February 1993 to serve a warrant, a massive gun battle broke out, killing 4 agents and 6 followers. What followed was a 51-day standoff that the entire country watched on live television. The FBI eventually moved in with tanks, and the compound burned to the ground, killing 76 people, including 25 children. America watched it happen in real time and could not believe what it was seeing. 27. John Wilkes Booth was a famous and celebrated actor, which meant he had no trouble walking into Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on the night of April 14, 1865, because everybody there knew his face and let him right in. He walked up behind President Abraham Lincoln during the third act of the play and shot him in the back of the head, then jumped from the presidential box to the stage below, breaking his leg on the way down. He shouted something dramatic in Latin because he was an actor to the end. He escaped into Virginia but was cornered in a tobacco barn 12 days later and shot dead. He thought he would be a hero and became the most hated man in American history instead. 28. H.H. Holmes built a hotel in Chicago specifically designed to kill people and checked guests into rooms connected to gas lines, trap doors, and a basement that contained a dissection table, acid vats, and a kiln for burning bodies. He did this during the 1893 World's Fair, when Chicago was flooded with out-of-town visitors who had nobody waiting for them at home. He was a doctor, a con man, and a charming pathological liar who kept changing his name and his story right up until the end. He confessed to 27 murders, though the real number was probably much higher. He was hanged in 1896 and is widely considered America's first documented serial killer, and genuinely one of the most creative monsters who ever lived. 29. James Holmes walked into a midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises in Aurora, Colorado in July 2012, dressed in tactical gear and opened fire on a theater full of people who thought the gunshots were part of the movie experience at first. 12 people died, and 70 were injured in one of the deadliest mass shootings in Colorado history. Holmes was a neuroscience PhD student who had been showing serious warning signs for months and had even contacted a university mental health professional who had raised flags about his behavior. He was arrested in the parking lot behind the theater, still in his gear. He was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences plus 3,318 years in prison, which feels like they were making a point. 30. The Long Island serial killer dumped at least 10 bodies along Ocean Parkway on Long Island starting in the late 1990s, and investigators only discovered them in 2010 when a completely unrelated missing person search stumbled onto the first remains. This killer was organized, methodical, and careful enough to wrap victims in burlap and scatter remains across miles of isolated beach. One victim called a sex crimes tip line from a cell phone while hiding from her attacker, and police traced the call but never found her in time. The case remains officially unsolved, despite years of investigation, multiple suspects, and a country full of amateur detectives convinced they know who did it. 31. Meyer Lansky was 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed about 140 pounds, never carried a gun, and somehow became the financial genius behind the entire American mob for 5 decades, managing money for every major crime family in the country like a very dangerous accountant. He helped build Las Vegas from a desert into a gambling empire-invested mob, money in Cuban casinos and offshore accounts, and was so good at hiding money that the IRS investigated him for years and could barely make anything stick. The FBI called him the mob's accountant, and J. Edgar Hoover personally despised him. Lansky died of natural causes in 1983 at age 80, having outlived almost every gangster he ever worked with. 32. Belle Starr was a Missouri woman who rode horses, wore pistols on both hips, hung out with Jesse James and the Younger Brothers, and became so famous that newspapers called her the Bandit Queen of the Indian Territory, even though historians argue she was more of a horse thief and criminal associate than an actual outlaw mastermind. She was convicted of horse theft and served time in a federal prison, which she apparently treated more like an inconvenience than a punishment. She was shot in the back twice from behind while riding home alone in 1889, and nobody was ever charged. Her murder remains unsolved, and her legend only grew bigger after she died. 33. Warren Jeffs was the leader of a polygamous sect in Utah and Arizona, who had himself declared a prophet, controlled thousands of followers, assigned women and girls as wives to men of his choosing, and expelled any man he considered a threat by simply kicking them out of the community. With nothing. He was placed on the FBI Most Wanted list in 2006 and was caught during a routine traffic stop in Nevada when an officer pulled over his Cadillac Escalade and found him hiding in the back with disguises, cash, and cell phones. He was convicted of child sexual assault in Texas in 2011 and sentenced to life in prison plus 99 years, and is still leading his church from his prison cell through written messages. 34. Leon Czolgosz was a 28-year-old factory worker from Michigan who decided that President William McKinley was the enemy of working people and showed up to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in September 1901 with a gun, wrapped in a handkerchief pretending to have an injured hand. McKinley was shaking hands with the public in a receiving line and actually reached out to shake Czolgosz's bandaged hand right before Czolgosz shot him twice in the stomach. McKinley survived the initial shooting and seemed to be recovering, but died 8 days later from gangrene because his doctors could not find one of the bullets. Czolgosz was executed by electric chair just 45 days after the assassination, which remains one of the fastest executions in American history. 35. Ed Gein was a quiet, soft-spoken farmer from Plainfield, Wisconsin, who barely left his property, had almost no social life, and was considered by neighbors to be a harmless, if slightly odd, loner. When police finally searched his farmhouse in 1957, they found bowls made from human skulls, lampshades made from human skin, a belt made of female nipples, and a refrigerator full of human organs. Ed Gein had been robbing graves and collecting body parts for years without anybody noticing. He inspired 3 of Hollywood's most iconic horror characters, including Norman Bates Leatherface and Hannibal Lecter. The quiet farmer from Wisconsin accidentally invented the entire slasher film genre. 36. Dylan Roof walked into Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina in June 2015, sat with a Bible study group for a full hour, letting congregation members be kind to him before opening fire and killing 9 people, including the pastor, who was also a state senator. He told police he almost did not go through with it because everyone had been so nice to him. He downloaded his own manifesto online, bought his own gun, and drove himself to the church. He was caught the next morning during a traffic stop in North Carolina after a citizen recognized his car. He was 21 years old, sentenced to death, and became the face of a national conversation about Confederate symbols that America is still having today. 37. Joseph James DeAngelo was a former police officer who spent 44 years living as a completely normal suburban grandfather in Sacramento, California, while being the Golden State Killer responsible for at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and 100 burglaries across California in the 1970s and 1980s. Investigators had chased his case 4 decades with 0 suspects until 2018, when a genealogy website called GED Match got involved, and researchers uploaded his DNA profile and matched it to distant relatives, which eventually led them right to his front door. Police dug through his trash to confirm the match. A retired cop who terrorized California for a decade was caught because somebody submitted their DNA to a family history website looking for their great-great-grandparents. 38. Bugsy Siegel was a founding member of Murder Incorporated, the mob's professional killing division, and was personally responsible for an unknown number of deaths, yet somehow became one of the most glamorous figures in American crime history, largely because he was handsome, charming, and had the wild idea to build a luxury casino resort in the middle of the Nevada desert. That casino was the Flamingo, and it opened in 1946 way over budget and nearly broke. His mob partners decided they were done with him and had him shot through the window of his girlfriend's Beverly Hills living room in 1947. When police arrived at the Flamingo to notify his associates, 20 minutes later they had already moved into his office. 39. Bonnie and Clyde were 2 broke Texas kids in their early 20s who robbed gas stations, grocery stores, and small banks across the Depression-era South and Midwest, while becoming the most famous outlaw couple in American history, entirely because newspapers could not get enough of them. They were not particularly successful criminals and spent most of their time barely scraping by while living out of stolen cars. What made them legends was the photos they took of themselves posing with guns and sending them to newspapers like the original social media influencers of crime. They were ambushed on a Louisiana back road in May 1934 by 6 lawmen who fired 130 rounds into their car without warning, and America mourned them like celebrities. 40. Keith Raniere founded a self-improvement organization called NXIVM in upstate New York that charged thousands of dollars for personal development courses, recruited successful professional women, and eventually revealed an inner secret society where female members were branded with his initials using a cauterizing iron and required to provide compromising photos of themselves as collateral to ensure their silence. He called himself the world's smartest man and had his followers address him as Vanguard. Allison Mack from the television show Smallville was one of his top recruiters. He fled to Mexico when investigations started closing in and was caught in a luxury villa in Puerto Vallarta in 2018. He is currently serving 120 years in federal prison and still has supporters who believe he was set up. 41. Charles Guiteau shot President Garfield in 1881. Because Garfield would not give him an ambassador job he had absolutely no qualifications for. He had been showing up to the White House demanding the position until security basically threw him out. Garfield actually survived the bullet, but died from infection because his doctors kept poking the wound with unwashed fingers. Guiteau pointed this out at his trial and was technically correct. He was hanged in 1882 and reportedly skipped to the gallows while humming a little tune he had written about himself. 42. Dennis Rader was a church president, a compliance officer, and a Boy Scout leader in Wichita, Kansas, who spent 30 years sending taunting letters to police about his own murders, then went completely quiet for years, and everyone assumed he was dead or gone. He came back in 2004 sending more letters and asked police if a floppy disk could be traced back to him. Police said no on television. He sent the disk. It was traced directly to his church computer. BTK, the killer who outsmarted police for 3 decades, got caught because he fell for the oldest trick in the book. 43. Omar Mateen called 911 during his own attack on Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida in June 2016 to make sure everybody knew why he was doing it while simultaneously holding 320 people hostage inside. He killed 49 people in what was the deadliest mass shooting in American history at that time. Investigators later found his motive was far more complicated and personal than it first appeared. His own father sat behind his wife during her trial wearing an American flag pin. The whole case kept getting stranger the deeper investigators looked, and America spent months trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. 44. Robert William Fisher blew up his own house in Scottsdale, Arizona in April 2001 with his wife and 2 children still inside, then simply drove away into the Arizona wilderness and vanished completely. He made the FBI Most Wanted list and has never been found. No confirmed sightings, no body, no arrest. Investigators believe he survived in the wilderness using his hunting and survival skills because Fisher was an experienced outdoorsman who knew exactly how to disappear. He would be in his late 50s today and is still officially listed as one of America's most wanted fugitives, which means he might just be out there somewhere right now. 45. Frank Costello ran the Luciano crime family so smoothly and politically that he became known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld because he preferred bribing judges and politicians over shooting people, which was honestly a refreshing change of pace for the mob. He had so many politicians in his pocket that investigators once found his phone number in the personal address books of multiple sitting judges. A rival named Vito Genovese finally got tired of his diplomatic approach and had him shot in the lobby of his own apartment building in 1957. The bullet grazed his head. Costello survived identified, nobody said nothing, and went right back to his business the next morning. 46. Pretty boy Floyd robbed banks across Oklahoma and the Midwest during the Depression, and became so popular with regular people that crowds would line up to wave at him as he drove through small towns. He reportedly destroyed mortgage documents during bank robberies, so farmers could not be foreclosed on, which made him a folk hero whether it was true or not. The FBI and local law enforcement chased him for years. He was finally shot dead in an Ohio cornfield in 1934 by FBI agents and local police. 10,000 people showed up to his funeral in Oklahoma, making it one of the largest funerals the state had ever seen. 47. Jeffrey Epstein was a wealthy financier with a private island, a private jet, and a little black book full of some of the most powerful names in American politics, business, and entertainment. He ran an underage trafficking operation for years while moving freely through elite social circles and was arrested in 2006 charged with soliciting a minor and received a deal so shockingly lenient that the prosecutor who arranged it later became a cabinet secretary. He was arrested again in 2019 on federal trafficking charges and died in his jail cell 2 months later in what was officially ruled a suicide. Half of America immediately did not believe that, and the debate has never stopped since. 48. Squeaky Fromm was a devoted Charles Manson follower who in September 1975 walked up to President Gerald Ford in a Sacramento park, pulled out a loaded gun, and pointed it directly at him from about 2 feet away. The gun did not fire because there was no bullet in the chamber. Secret Service agents tackled her immediately, and Ford stood there in genuine shock. When asked why she did it, she said she wanted to get Manson's attention and give him a platform. She was sentenced to life in prison and was released in 2009. She never expressed any real regret, and Manson never once acknowledged what she had done for him. 49. Gary Ridgway confessed to killing 49 women in and around Seattle, Washington, making him officially the most prolific serial killer in American history at the time of his confession. He had been interviewed by police multiple times during the original investigation, passed a polygraph test, and was released each time. He worked at a truck painting factory for 32 years, showing up every day like a completely normal employee while committing murders on the side. He was finally caught in 2001 through DNA evidence that had been sitting in a lab for years. He accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty by agreeing to reveal where all the bodies were. Washington State reluctantly agreed. 50. Stephen Paddock checked into the Mandalay Bay Hotel in Las Vegas in October 2017. As a normal high-roller gambler, hauled 23 rifles up to his 32nd floor suite over several days without anyone noticing, and then opened fire on a crowd of 22,000 concert-goers below, killing 60 people and injuring over 400 in the deadliest mass shooting in American history. He had no criminal record, no clear motive, and no manifesto. Investigators spent years trying to understand why and never found a satisfying answer. Paddock had shot himself before police breached his room. To this day, the official motive remains unknown, and that fact alone keeps America up at night. 51. Syed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik were a married couple living in Redlands, California, who attended a holiday office party in San Bernardino. In December 2015, then left early, came back with rifles and opened fire on Farouk's own co-workers, killing 14 people. Tashfeen Malik posted a pledge of allegiance to ISIS on Facebook while the attack was happening. They fled in an SUV and were killed in a shootout with police a few hours later. The thing that stunned investigators most was that neighbors had noticed suspicious activity at their home for weeks, but said nothing because they did not want to seem like they were profiling. America had a very uncomfortable conversation after that. 52. Vito Genovese spent decades clawing his way to the top of New York organized crime through betrayal, murder, and sheer ruthlessness, eventually becoming boss of what became the most powerful crime family in America. He fled to Italy in 1937 to avoid a murder charge, came back after World War II, and immediately started eliminating rivals again like he had never left. He orchestrated the famous Appalachian meeting in 1957, where 100 mob bosses gathered at a New York farmhouse and got accidentally busted when a state trooper got suspicious about all the expensive cars parked outside. Genovese died in prison in 1969, still technically running his family from his cell through trusted messengers. 53. Babyface Nelson was the most trigger-happy and genuinely unhinged member of the Dillinger Gang who killed more FBI agents than any other criminal in American history, and seemed to actually enjoy the violence in a way that made even his own partners uncomfortable. He was 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed 135 pounds, and absolutely hated being called Babyface, to the point where mentioning the nickname around him was considered genuinely dangerous. He died in November 1934 after a shootout with 2 FBI agents on a rural Illinois road where he absorbed 17 bullet wounds and kept shooting until both agents were dead before finally collapsing. He was 25 years old. 54. Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling ran Enron, the 7th largest company in America, and used accounting tricks, creative lying, and breathtaking corporate arrogance to hide billions in debt while encouraging employees to pour their retirement savings into company stock they knew was worthless. When Enron collapsed in 2001, it was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at that time, and thousands of employees lost their entire retirement savings overnight. Skilling went to prison. Ken Lay was convicted but died of a heart attack before sentencing, and his conviction was legally erased because he died before appeal, which meant he technically died an innocent man. America found that spectacularly infuriating. 55. Sarah Jane Moore was a 45-year-old political activist and FBI informant who stood outside the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco in September 1975 and fired a revolver at President Gerald Ford from 40 feet away. A bystander in the crowd named Oliver Sipple grabbed her arm as she fired, causing the bullet to miss. Ford was unharmed. This was the second assassination attempt on Ford in less than 3 weeks, making September 1975 arguably the worst month of Gerald Ford's entire life. Moore was sentenced to life in prison and released in 2007. She later said she regretted missing, which is not something most people would admit out loud. 56. Samuel Little confessed to 93 murders between 1970 and 2005, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history, according to the FBI, who verified 61 of his confessions. He traveled constantly across the country, targeting women he believed nobody would miss. And he was tragically right because many of his victims went unreported for years. He was only caught in 2012 on an unrelated drug charge when a DNA match linked him to 3 cold case murders in Los Angeles. He was already 72 years old. He spent his final years in prison drawing detailed portraits of his victims from memory and providing confessions that helped investigators close dozens of cold cases across 19 states. 57. Adam Lanza walked into Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut in December 2012 and killed 20 children between 6 and 7 years old and 6 staff members in one of the most devastating and heartbreaking tragedies in American history. He had shot his own mother at home before driving to the school. He left no note, no clear manifesto, and no explanation that made any real sense. The investigation revealed he had been deeply isolated and consumed by violent obsessions for years. The tragedy immediately reignited America's fiercest debate about gun control, mental health, and school safety, and that debate has not stopped for a single day since. 58. Carlo Gambino rose to become the most powerful mob boss in America, not by being the loudest or most violent, but by being the most patient and most calculating man in any room he ever entered. He engineered the murder of his own boss, Albert Anastasia, in 1957 by simply doing nothing to protect him, and then stepped into the power vacuum so smoothly that nobody could prove a thing. The Gambino crime family he built became the largest and most powerful in the country, and his influence was so vast that the fictional Corleone family in The Godfather was partly inspired by him. He died of natural causes in 1976, which for a mob boss of his level was basically a miracle. 59. Machine Gun Kelly got his famous nickname entirely from his wife, who trained him to use a Thompson submachine gun because he was not particularly intimidating on his own, and she thought a good nickname would help his criminal career, which is both supportive and deeply concerning. He and his wife masterminded the kidnapping of Oklahoma oil tycoon Charles Urschel in 1933 and collected a ransom, but left so many clues that the FBI tracked them down within weeks. When agents burst through his door, Kelly reportedly shouted, "Please do not shoot G-men," which is the moment the term G-men entered American popular culture. His wife got the same prison sentence he did, and investigators agreed she was the scarier one. 60. Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos at age 19, dropped out of Stanford, convinced investors the company could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood, raised $900 million, wore a black turtleneck every day to channel Steve Jobs, and built a valuation of $9 billion entirely on technology that simply did not work. Patients received false medical results. Doctors made treatment decisions based on faulty data. Real people were genuinely harmed. Holmes maintained her visionary founder persona right through her criminal trial, batting her eyes, and speaking in a mysteriously deep voice she apparently performed on purpose. She was convicted of fraud in 2022 and sentenced to over 11 years in federal prison. 61. Giuseppe Zangara was an Italian immigrant bricklayer who showed up to a public event in Miami in February 1933 with a cheap pistol and tried to shoot President-elect Franklin Roosevelt from 25 feet away. He missed Roosevelt entirely, but hit 5 other people, including Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak, who died 3 weeks later. Zangara was 5 feet tall and claimed he stood on a wobbly folding chair which affected his aim. He showed zero remorse, told the judge he wished he had killed all presidents, and was executed in Florida's electric chair just 33 days after the shooting. Barely enough time for the ink on his conviction to dry. 62. David Berkowitz terrorized New York City for an entire year between 1976 and 1977, shooting people sitting in parked cars late at night and sending taunting letters to newspapers calling himself the Son of Sam, while an entire city of 8 million people genuinely panicked. He claimed his neighbor's dog told him to do it. The neighbor's name was Sam. New York City was so terrified that nightlife visibly died down, and women reportedly cut their hair because he seemed to prefer women with long, dark hair. He was caught because of a parking ticket near one of the crime scenes. A parking ticket. New York City was never the same after that summer. 63. Seung-Hui Cho killed 32 people at Virginia Tech in April 2007 in the deadliest school shooting in American history, mailing a package of videos, photographs, and a written manifesto to NBC News between his first and second attacks that morning. The university had received multiple warnings about his disturbing behavior from professors and fellow students years before the attack. A court had previously found him mentally ill, but he was never properly entered into the background check system that should have prevented him from legally buying the guns he used. The failures were systemic, layered, and heartbreaking, and Virginia Tech has spent every year since trying to make sense of what went wrong. 64. John Gotti took over the Gambino crime family in 1985 by having his own boss, Paul Castellano, shot outside a Manhattan steakhouse and then showed up to the crime scene afterward to survey the situation personally, which was extraordinarily bold. He wore $1,000 suits, gave out turkeys at Christmas, held street festivals in his Queens neighborhood, and loved the camera so much that tabloids nicknamed him the Dapper Don. He beat 3 federal cases through jury tampering and witness intimidation and seemed completely untouchable until his own underboss Sammy the Bull Gravano flipped and testified against him in 1992. Gotti died in prison in May 2002, still acting like he ran everything. 65. Black Bart robbed 28 Wells Fargo stagecoaches across California between 1877 and 1883. Using an unloaded shotgun, wore a flour sack over his head, and left handwritten poems at the crime scenes, taunting the company he kept robbing. Wells Fargo hired its best detective to catch him. He was finally identified through a handkerchief he left behind at a robbery scene that had a laundry mark traceable to a specific San Francisco laundry shop. The most poetic stagecoach robber in American history got caught because he forgot to pick up his hanky. He served 6 years in prison, and upon release was immediately asked by reporters if he planned to write more poetry. 66. Jordan Belfort ran a Long Island brokerage firm called Stratton Oakmont in the 1990s, where his brokers called Americans and pushed worthless penny stocks using pure pressure and manipulation to steal hundreds of millions of dollars from everyday investors. He threw parties at the office with dwarfs and marching bands, spent money with a recklessness that genuinely defied logic, and sank a yacht in a Mediterranean storm because he insisted on sailing through a weather warning. He cooperated with the FBI, ratted out his partners, and served just 22 months in prison. He then became a motivational speaker, charging thousands per ticket to teach people sales techniques. America somehow let that happen. 67. Arthur Bremer was a 21-year-old busboy from Milwaukee who followed President Nixon around the country for weeks, trying to get close enough to shoot him, failing repeatedly because Secret Service kept blocking his access. He then shifted his attention to Democratic presidential candidate George Wallace and shot him 4 times at a Maryland campaign rally in May 1972, paralyzing Wallace from the waist down for the rest of his life. Bremer's diary revealed he did not care about politics at all and just wanted to be famous. He served 35 years in prison, was released in 2007, and has lived in complete obscurity ever since, which is exactly the opposite of what he wanted. 68. Marcus Wayne Chenault walked into Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta in June 1974 during Sunday services and shot Martin Luther King Sr. while he sat at the organ, killing him and a church deacon. King Sr. was the father of Martin Luther King Jr., who had been assassinated 6 years earlier, making the King family's loss almost incomprehensibly tragic. Chenault claimed he targeted black church leaders because he believed they were a distraction from his own radical beliefs. He was sentenced to death, but the King family personally advocated against his execution. His sentence was commuted to life in prison, and he died there in 1995. 69. Albert Fish was a mild-mannered grandfather type who rode the New York subway knitting quietly and was arrested and released by police 9 times before anyone realized he was one of the most disturbing serial killers America had ever produced. He confessed to 3 child murders and claimed to have harmed children in every state in the country. He was so genuinely strange that his own defense attorney said he had never in his career encountered a more depraved individual. Fish was electrocuted at Sing Sing prison in 1936 and reportedly told guards the electric chair would be the only thrill he had not yet tried. The guards had no response to that. 70. Charles Whitman was an Eagle Scout, a former Marine and a University of Texas student who climbed the University Clock Tower in Austin in August 1966 with a footlocker full of weapons and food, and shot 46 people, killing 16 from a height of 300 feet before police finally reached him. He had killed his wife and mother the night before, leaving notes saying he did not want them to face the shame of what he was about to do. An autopsy found a brain tumor pressing on his amygdala, though experts still debate how much it influenced his actions. The University of Texas did not talk openly about that day for decades. 71. Charles Starkweather was a 19-year-old garbage collector from Lincoln, Nebraska, who idolized James Dean, dyed his hair red to look like him, and then went on a murderous road trip across Nebraska and Wyoming in 1958 with his 14-year-old girlfriend, killing 11 people in 2 months. His girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate, claimed she was a hostage the entire time. Nobody fully believed her, But nobody fully disbelieved her either. Starkweather was executed in Nebraska's electric chair in 1959. He inspired so many movies, books, and songs that Hollywood essentially built an entire genre around his road trip from hell. 72. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold walked into Columbine High School in Colorado in April. 1999 killed 13 people and wounded 21 others in an attack that permanently changed how America thinks about school safety. They had planned something far larger involving bombs that failed to detonate properly. Both boys had shown serious warning signs for over a year, including a website where Harris openly described his plans. Both died by suicide inside the library. Columbine became a word that meant something terrible, and every school shooting that came after was measured against it in a way that still haunts the country today. 73. Sam Giancana ran the Chicago outfit with an iron fist throughout the 1950s and 1960s, was so politically connected that he reportedly helped John F. Kennedy win Illinois in 1960 and was simultaneously recruited by the CIA to help assassinate Fidel Castro, making him possibly the most dangerously connected criminal in American history. He dated a woman who also dated President Kennedy at the same time. The FBI surveilled him so obsessively that he sued them and won. He was shot 6 times in his own kitchen in 1975, right before he was scheduled to testify before a Senate committee. Nobody was ever charged. 74. John Wesley Hardin was a Texas outlaw who claimed to have killed 42 men, making him the deadliest gunfighter in American history, though historians argue the real number was closer to 27, which is still an absolutely staggering body count. He once shot a man through a hotel wall because the man was snoring too loudly in the next room. He was captured, studied law in prison, was released, became a lawyer, and was shot in the back of the head in an El Paso saloon in 1895. The man who killed more people than almost any other gunfighter in the West was shot while his back was turned. 75. Tony Accardo ran the Chicago outfit for over 50 years and was so careful and so ruthless that he was never convicted of a single serious crime his entire life, despite being investigated by the FBI for decades. He earned the nickname Joe Batters from Al Capone himself, after Accardo used a baseball bat on some people who needed a lesson in loyalty. When burglars broke into his home while he was out of town in 1978, every single one of them turned up dead within weeks. Nobody investigated too hard. Even criminals knew better than to rob Tony Accardo. 76. Tom Horn was a former Army Scout Pinkerton detective and legitimate frontier legend who became a hired killer for Wyoming cattle barons, shooting rustlers and troublemakers for $600 per confirmed kill. He was meticulous, almost artistic about his work, leaving a rock under each victim's head as his personal signature. He was convicted of killing a 14-year-old boy in 1901 in a case built largely on a confession he claimed was made while he was drunk. He was hanged in Cheyenne, Wyoming in 1903 and went to the gallows, completely calm, telling the sheriff it was the finest hanging he had ever seen. 77. Dean Corll was a candy factory worker in Houston, Texas, who gave free candy to neighborhood children and was so universally liked that parents trusted him completely, while he and 2 teenage accomplices murdered at least 28 boys between 1970 and 1973 in what became known as the Houston Mass Murders. The killings only stopped when one of his own accomplices shot him dead. When police started digging, they found bodies buried under a boat shed and in local fields. Houston was completely blindsided. The case was so enormous and so devastating that national media barely covered it, which remains one of the stranger footnotes in American crime journalism. 78. Patrick Crucius drove 10 hours from his home in Allen, Texas, to a Walmart in El Paso in August 2019 and opened fire on shoppers, killing 23 people in one of the deadliest anti-Latino hate crimes in American history. He posted a manifesto online minutes before the attack. He surrendered to police immediately after the shooting, walking up to officers with his hands up, saying, "I am the shooter," which investigators found both chilling and bizarrely cooperative. He pleaded guilty to federal hate crime charges in 2023 and received 90 consecutive life sentences. The state of Texas still plans to pursue the death penalty separately. 79. Mickey Cohen was Al Capone's successor in Los Angeles, a former boxer who loved publicity more than almost any gangster in history, regularly calling press conferences, giving newspaper interviews, and complaining loudly when the IRS came after him. He survived multiple assassination attempts, including a bomb planted outside his house and a shooting at Sherry's restaurant on Sunset Strip that injured 3 of his associates. He was finally brought down not by rival gangsters, but by tax evasion charges in 1961 and sent to Alcatraz. He died of natural causes in 1976, having spent more time in front of cameras than most actual Hollywood stars of his era. 80. Ma Barker was the mother of the Barker Gang, and the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover called her the most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain America had ever produced. Historians and criminologists have argued ever since that she was mostly just someone's mom who had absolutely no idea what her sons were doing. Her sons robbed banks, kidnapped wealthy businessmen, and killed law enforcement officers across the Midwest throughout the early 1930s. Ma and her son Fred were killed in a 4-hour shootout with FBI agents in Florida in 1935. Hoover needed her to be the mastermind. Whether she actually was remains one of American crime history's most entertaining debates. 81. Randy Kraft was a computer programmer from Southern California who worked normal jobs, had normal friends, and was so unremarkable that nobody suspected anything for over a decade while he murdered at least 16 young men across California, Oregon, and Michigan. He was caught in 1983 when a highway patrol officer pulled over his car and found a passenger who appeared to be asleep. The passenger was dead. Police then searched his trunk and found a coded list investigators called the scorecard that appeared to reference 61 victims. Kraft sat through his entire trial doing his own legal work and eating lunch calmly every single day. 82. Robert Bowers walked into the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in October 2018, shouting anti-Semitic statements and opened fire during Saturday morning services, killing 11 people in the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in American history. He had posted violently anti-Semitic content online for months before the attack, and law enforcement had no prior record of him. He was wounded in a shootout with police and arrested inside the building. He was convicted on all 63 federal counts against him in 2023 and sentenced to death. Pittsburgh spent years rebuilding its sense of safety, and the Tree of Life Synagogue became a national memorial site. 83. Frank Nitti was Al Capone's enforcer, and the man who kept the Chicago outfit running smoothly while Capone was in prison, earning the nickname the Enforcer for his willingness to handle problems personally and permanently. He survived an assassination attempt in 1932 when a corrupt Chicago detective shot him 3 times inside City Hall, which is an extraordinary place to get shot. He recovered, took revenge through political connections, and kept running Chicago's underworld with quiet efficiency. In 1943, facing federal extortion charges and terrified of returning to prison, Nitti walked to a Chicago railroad yard and shot himself. Even his exit was dramatic. 84. William Quantrill led the most devastating Confederate guerrilla raid of the Civil War when he and 400 raiders attacked Lawrence, Kansas in August 1863, killing 150 unarmed civilian men and boys and burning the town nearly to the ground in what became known as the Lawrence Massacre. He specifically targeted Lawrence because it was a known abolitionist stronghold, and he wanted to send a message that could not be misunderstood. Jesse James and the younger brothers rode with Quantrill's raiders and learned everything they knew about violence and intimidation from him. Quantrill was shot by Union soldiers in Kentucky in 1865 and died a few weeks later at age 27. 85. John Edward Robinson lured women through early internet chat rooms in the 1990s by posing as a wealthy businessman and job recruiter, making him arguably America's first internet serial killer before most people even knew what the internet was. He stored victims in barrels on his rural Kansas and Missouri properties, and one barrel sat in a storage unit for years, while the facility manager occasionally complained about the smell. He was caught in 2000 when detectives investigating a missing woman searched his properties and found 5 barrels. Robinson had been conning people since the 1960s and had somehow avoided serious consequences for 4 decades. 86. John Allen Muhammad and his teenage accomplice Lee Boyd Malvo terrorized the entire Washington, D.C. metro area for 3 weeks in October 2002, shooting 13 people from the eyeshole trunk of a modified Chevrolet Caprice, while the entire region shut down in fear. Gas stations erected tarps so customers could fill their tanks without being visible from the road. Parents stopped letting children wait outside for school buses. The FBI and local police received 100,000 tips and chased leads across the country before a tip from a truck driver led them to a rest stop where Muhammad and Malvo were found asleep in their car. 87. Vincent the Chin Gigante was the boss of the Genovese crime family and spent 30 years shuffling around Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, muttering to himself, convincing doctors, judges, and prosecutors that he was too mentally ill to stand trial while secretly running one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America from the back room of a social club. He was so committed to the act that FBI agents called it the Odd Father. He finally admitted in 2003 while already in prison for other charges that he had faked. The mental illness, the entire time. 30 years of Oscar-worthy performance, and he admitted it almost casually. 88. Sam Bass was a Texas outlaw who robbed so many stagecoaches and trains in the late 1870s that the Texas Rangers made him their top priority, and he became one of the most wanted men in the state almost overnight. He was betrayed by a member of his own gang who tipped off the Rangers about a planned bank robbery in Round Rock, Texas in 1878. Bass rode into Round Rock anyway, was shot during the robbery, and died 2 days later on his 27th birthday. His gang member collected the reward money, and Sam Bass became a Texas folk legend, which is a very Texan way for a story to end. 89. Paul Castellano was the boss of the Gambino crime family and preferred running his criminal empire from his Staten Island mansion, which his men called the White House, where he held court like a corporate executive rather than a traditional street boss. His own crews resented him for being too removed, too greedy, and too focused on white-collar crime over traditional mob operations. John Gotti decided he had waited long enough and had Castellano shot 6 times outside Spark Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan in December 1985, right before Christmas. Gotti watched from a car across the street to make sure it was done properly and then drove away. 90. Sam Bass robbed his first Union Pacific train in Nebraska in 1877, and his gang made off with $60,000 in freshly minted gold coins, which remains one of the largest train robberies in American history. The problem was that gold coins are extremely heavy, extremely identifiable, and very difficult to spend without attracting immediate attention. His gang members started getting arrested almost immediately because they kept trying to spend the coins in local saloons and shops, where bartenders and shopkeepers recognized them instantly. The most successful train robbery of the era was undone because outlaws could not resist buying drinks with stolen gold. 91. Robert Hansen was an Anchorage, Alaska bakery owner who was so shy and socially awkward that nobody suspected him of anything more threatening than overselling cinnamon rolls. He kidnapped women, flew them in his private plane to remote Alaskan wilderness, and hunted them like animals for sport. He did this for 12 years. A victim escaped in 1983, and police initially believed Hansen's alibi over her testimony because he seemed so harmless. They searched his house anyway and found a map with 17 marked locations. Each location had a body. Alaska has never quite gotten over it. 92. Joe Bonanno founded one of New York's original 5 crime families, lived to age 97, and had the extraordinary nerve to write a best-selling autobiography called A Man of Honor, where he described his entire criminal career in flattering detail while somehow avoiding additional prosecution. He survived the Banana War, a violent internal power struggle within his own family, fled to Arizona, and lived quietly in Tucson for decades, while the FBI watched him constantly. He died peacefully in 2002, having outlived most of his enemies, his rivals, and several generations of FBI agents assigned specifically to catch him doing something prosecutable. 93. Jerry Brudos was an Oregon electrician with a shoe obsession that started in childhood and escalated into something so disturbing that investigators struggled to describe it in courtroom language. He killed 4 women in Oregon between 1968 and 1969, and was caught because he showed up to the State University campus asking suspicious questions, and a student reported him. Police traced his car, and the case unraveled quickly from there. His wife claimed she had no idea which investigators found difficult to believe given what was happening in their garage. Brudos died in prison in 2006, having never fully explained himself to anyone's satisfaction. 94. Harvey Glattman was a television repairman in Los Angeles who placed fake modeling ads in newspapers in the late 1950s, offering women paid photo shoots, then used the sessions to photograph his victims before killing them. He kept the photographs afterward as trophies. He was caught in 1958 when his final intended victim fought back, grabbed his gun during a struggle on a remote desert road, and held him at gunpoint until a highway patrol officer happened to drive past. California executed him in 1959. His case directly inspired law enforcement to develop some of the earliest criminal profiling techniques used by investigators today. 95. Paul John Knowles was a Florida convict who was released from prison in 1974, got engaged to a woman through prison correspondence, flew to meet her in San Francisco, and was immediately dumped. He responded by going on a 4-month cross-country killing spree, murdering between 18 and 35 people across 20 states before being caught in Georgia. He was so charming during interviews that a female journalist fell in love with him while he was awaiting trial. He was shot dead by an FBI agent during an escape attempt in December 1974 while handcuffed, which raised questions nobody ever fully answered. 96. Carl Eugene Watts was a Michigan and Texas serial killer who was nicknamed Sunday Morning Slasher and confessed to 13 murders, but is suspected of killing up to 100 women, making him potentially the most prolific serial killer in American history. He was initially convicted in Texas in 1982 on a burglary charge because prosecutors offered him immunity for murder confessions to clear cold cases, which remains one of the most controversial plea deals in American legal history. He was eventually convicted of first-degree murder in Michigan in 2004 and died in prison in 2007 before investigators could confirm how many victims there actually were. 97. Donald Harvey worked as a hospital orderly in Ohio and Kentucky for nearly 2 decades and killed somewhere between 37 and 57 patients by poisoning them with arsenic cyanide and other substances, while co-workers thought he was a dedicated and compassionate caregiver. He was only caught in 1987 when an autopsy on one of his victims detected cyanide, and investigators started looking more closely at the unusual death rate on his ward. Harvey told investigators he considered himself a mercy killer, though many of his victims were not terminally ill. He was beaten to death by a fellow inmate in prison in 2017. 98. William Bonin was a California truck driver who committed murders across Los Angeles and Orange counties between 1979 and 1980 with multiple accomplices who he recruited separately and who did not always know about each other. He was so active during the same period as several other California serial killers that investigators initially struggled to distinguish his crimes from others operating simultaneously in the same area. He was caught when one accomplice told a friend who told police. Bonin became the first person executed by lethal injection in California in 1996 and reportedly ate 2 large pepperoni pizzas for his last meal without sharing. 99. Juan Corona was a labor contractor in Yuba City, California, who recruited migrant farm workers for local orchards and was considered a reliable and well-connected member of the agricultural community right up until 1971, when a farmer found a freshly dug grave in his orchard and called police. Investigators eventually found 25 bodies buried across local farms, all bearing similar wounds, and all connected to Corona's labor operation. He was convicted of 25 murders in 1973 in what was at the time the largest mass murder conviction in American history. He was stabbed by a fellow inmate in 1973 and lost sight in one eye. 100. Henry Lee Lucas was a one-eyed drifter from Virginia who confessed to over 600 murders across the United States, making him briefly the most prolific killer in history until investigators started checking his confessions and found he could not possibly have committed many of them because he was verifiably somewhere else at the time. Texas Rangers had used his confessions to clear hundreds of cold cases without properly verifying them, which became a massive scandal. The confirmed number of his actual murders is closer to 3, though he definitely committed more than that. He died in prison in 2001, leaving American true crime deeply confused about his actual body count. 101. Otis Toole was Henry Lee Lucas's travel companion and self-confessed accomplice who drifted across America committing crimes so casually that investigators in multiple states had interviewed him and let him go without connecting him to anything serious. He confessed to the 1981 abduction and murder of 6-year-old Adam Walsh, whose father John Walsh then created America's most wanted television show which helped catch hundreds of other criminals. Toole recanted his confession, then confessed again, then recanted again. He died in a Florida prison in 1996, and the Walsh case was officially closed in 2008. 102. Larry Eiler was an Indiana house painter who dumped victims so carelessly along rural Illinois and Indiana highways that investigators nicknamed him the Highway Killer before they even had a suspect. He was actually stopped by police in 1983 with a young man bound in his truck and was released because a judge ruled the stop was unlawful, throwing out all evidence. He killed again immediately after his release. He was finally convicted in 1986 when body parts were found in trash bags outside his Chicago apartment building, after his landlord complained about the smell. His lawyer knew where bodies were buried and said nothing for years. 103. Bobby Joe Long was a Tampa, Florida classified ads rapist who used newspaper personal ads to find victims in the early 1980s, before the internet made that sort of predatory behavior exponentially easier. He was linked to a series of murders through a single surviving victim who memorized details of his apartment, his car, and his routines during her captivity, and reported everything to police with extraordinary precision. Investigators caught him within days using her description. She was 17 years old. Long was executed in Florida in 2019, and that young woman's courage and memory directly saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. 104. Gerald Stano confessed to killing 41 women across Florida, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania throughout the 1970s, making him one of Florida's most prolific killers, though investigators spent years arguing about which confessions were genuine. He was initially caught in 1980, after a Daytona Beach detective noticed suspicious inconsistencies during a routine interview about an unrelated assault case. Stano was so eager to talk and so detailed in his confessions that investigators kept bringing him back for more interviews across multiple years. He was executed in Florida's electric chair in 1998, telling prison staff on his way out that the whole thing was a bummer. 105. Danny Rolling grew up in Gainesville, Florida, moved away, and then came back in August 1990 to murder 5 University of Florida students in their apartments over 3 days in attacks so brutal that the entire college town essentially emptied out as students fled home to their parents. He was already wanted for a shooting in Louisiana when he committed the Gainesville murders but was not connected to them immediately. He was caught on an unrelated burglary charge, and DNA eventually linked him to the murders. Rolling confessed, sang Christian hymns at his execution in 2006, and inspired the Scream movie franchise, which Florida finds deeply uncomfortable. 106. Keith Jesperson was a long-haul truck driver from the Pacific Northwest who killed 8 women between 1990 and 1995 and might never have been caught, except he became furious when someone else falsely confessed to one of his murders and took credit away from him. He responded by writing a letter to a newspaper confessing to the murder himself and signing it with a smiley face, earning him the nickname Happy Face Killer. He wrote hundreds of letters from prison to journalists, family members, and investigators over the years, seemingly unable to stop talking. He is currently serving life in Oregon and still writes letters constantly. 107. Aileen Wuornos was a Florida highway prostitute who shot 7 men along Florida highways between 1989 and 1990 and became one of the most debated figures in American criminal history because her supporters argued she acted in self-defense while prosecutors argued she was a calculated predator. Her case was turned into the movie Monster, starring Charlize Theron, who won an Academy Award for the role. Wuornos gave multiple contradictory interviews before her execution in 2002, including one where she claimed aliens were bombarding her with sonic pressure in her cell. She was executed in Florida and said she would be back. 108. Belle Gunnis was a Norwegian immigrant who settled on a farm in LaPorte, Indiana, placed Lonely Hearts advertisements in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest, inviting wealthy suitors to come meet her, and then murdered them for their life savings and insurance money. She killed somewhere between 25 and 40 people, including 2 of her own children and multiple husbands. Her farm burned down in 1908, and a headless female body was found inside, which everyone assumed was Belle. Most investigators believed she faked her own death and escaped. She was never found, and LaPorte, Indiana still talks about her like she might come back. 109. Wayne Williams was a 23-year-old aspiring music producer in Atlanta, Georgia, who was convicted of killing 2 adults during the Atlanta child murders investigation that had terrorized the city between 1979 and 1981, leaving at least 28 black children and young adults dead. He was caught when police staking out a bridge heard a splash and stopped his car moments later, finding fibers on his vehicle that matched fibers found on victims. He was convicted of 2 adult murders, and the child murder cases were officially closed, linking them to him, though families of victims have never stopped demanding a new investigation. 110. Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi were cousins who terrorized Los Angeles between 1977 and 1978, posing as undercover police officers to abduct young women, earning the nickname the Hillside Stranglers from local newspapers. Bianchi moved to Washington State after Los Angeles got too dangerous, continued killing there, and was caught after 2 murders in Bellingham. He then tried to escape conviction by faking multiple personality disorder so convincingly that it took a team of psychiatrists months to expose the deception. He eventually testified against his cousin Buono in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Both died in prison, having never expressed genuine remorse to anyone. 111. Angelo Buono died in his California prison cell in 2002 from a heart attack, and Kenneth Bianchi is still alive in a Washington state prison, occasionally requesting parole and being denied every single time. The Hillside Strangler case permanently changed how Los Angeles thought about trusting strangers, especially those flashing fake badges. It also exposed how easily people comply with authority figures, even in dangerous situations. 2 cousins who should have been completely unremarkable men managed to terrorize one of the largest cities in America for over a year before a completely separate crime in another state finally brought them down. America has always had monsters. Some wore suits, some wore badges, some wore nothing but a smile and a lie. And the scariest part is not that these people existed. The scariest part is that their neighbors called them normal. So next time somebody seems just a little too friendly, just a little too charming, just a little too perfect, remember that every single person on this list had somebody in their life who said, "I never would have guessed." Now here is your question. Which criminal on this list genuinely shocked you the most and why? Drop it in the comments right now, because some of your answers are going to be wilder than the actual video. If this list had you losing your mind the whole way through, smash that like button, subscribe to Dumb History, because we make the worst moments in history actually entertaining. And share this with that one friend who thinks they know everything about American crime. We will see you in the next one.